What's good, everyone? It's Nigel here, Trinidad Empowerment Network. So I'd get straight in. I wanted to make this video today because over the election period, I've become even more so acutely aware of the deep racism and division that still exists in Trinidad and Tobago today. And I wanted to make a video to speak on it, not to obviously divide us any further, but to help us understand, those of you who don't, of course, understand why this division exists today. And more importantly, who created it. Now, that's massively important to understand that, to understand where this division came from. I believe we weren't taught this sufficiently at school, at least when I was in school anyway. I don't know what the curriculums are like now, but for the most part, I was taught that Christopher Columbus discovered Trinidad, so he was a great man. How pathetic was that? Now, Trinidad is made up primarily of people of African and Indian descent, roughly a 50-50 split today as we stand, I would say. But that division didn't happen by accident. That split didn't happen by accident. It was engineered by the British colonial system. And that's how the system worked at that time. Now, when African slaves were brought to the Caribbean through the transatlantic slave trade, the slaves, my ancestors, were stripped of everything. Everything, including their language, their culture, and most importantly, their freedom. This was by design. This was no accident. This was deliberate. They were deliberately separated. They were placed into groups where no one spoke the same language. And that way, the inability to rebel was a lot higher. This was by design. So if these slaves couldn't organize or rebel, they were easier to control. Divide and rule from the colonial masters was always the method. Divide and rule. And guess what? It worked. So when slavery was abolished in 1834, the freed Africans were given nothing. No land, no compensation, no tools to rebuild their lives. Yet, over 45,000 British slave owners were compensated by the British government for the loss of their slaves. They argued this successfully in court and won. They had lost their source of income, so they deserved compensation from the British government. That was their argument in court. They won their argument, and they were compensated for the loss of their slaves to the tune of £20 million back then. That can be converted to, or should be converted to roughly £18 billion in today's money. You do the conversion from pounds into Trinidad dollars, and you see exactly how much it is worth to the Trinidad economy. Now let that sink in. The slave owners got paid. The slaves got nothing. So after the slave trade was eventually ended, actually it ended in 1838 because it went on for a further 4 years, called the apprenticeship period, despite being ended in 1834. The British couldn't last without slavery, so they had an apprenticeship period for 4 years. And after slavery officially ended, the British still needed cheap labor. They still needed cheap labor. So between 1845 and 1917, they brought in indentured laborers from British colonial India, a country already devastated by British colonialism. India, under British rule, had suffered massive famines, land seizures, and economic collapse. They destroyed that country, essentially. Millions were left in poverty. Millions. So, of course, when the colonizers came along and offered the poor Indians the chance to work in places like Trinidad and Guyana, amongst other Caribbean islands, guess what? They took the opportunity. What have they got to lose? What have they got to lose? They were living in British colonial India that was essentially destroyed. What have they got to lose? Most had never seen or probably even heard of the Caribbean. They were simply desperate for opportunities. However, these workers, these Indian workers, were not called slaves. The British called them indentured laborers. It gave them a different status. It gave them a false sense of superiority, supremacy, of worth. They were promised land after their contract ended. And of course, many actually received it. The Africans, on the other hand, were still landless and still fighting to survive. And that's when the colonial divide deepened. The colonial divide deepened. I could only imagine how that must have been. In any case, the British played both groups against each other. Indians were told they were better than the ex-slaves, and Africans saw newcomers getting land and opportunity that they never had. This naturally created tension. It naturally created tension. It naturally created resentment. And it naturally created division. Remember, this is all by design. If they created unity, people are more likely to uprise and rebel. They do not want unity. The colonial system did not want unity. The colonial system didn't just enslave people, it manipulated minds. It created the illusion that race determined your worth. And sadly, I'm making this video today because that illusion still exists today. So, the lasting impact of British colonial rule. We are still living with today in 2025. We see it in the way we judge beauty. Light skin and straight hair are still the standard of beauty, is still glorified. Skin bleaching is still commonplace in the Caribbean, in Africa, in India. I guaranteed if you are religious in some way, shape, or form, you are a Christian, before you go to bed, before you say your eat your meal, you say your prayer, and what enters your head is this idea, this fictitious white Jesus. They say a picture paints 1,000 words. That's colonialism still living in our psychology today. I remember in school being taught that Christopher Columbus discovered Trinidad and Tobago, and he was such a great man. Christopher Columbus, Christopher Columbus. Our teachers taught us this. Our teachers said it with pride. And as a child, you believe them. You absolutely do. My parents never corrected me on this. I believed that this man was a great man. No one bothered to answer the question, how do you discover a place where people already lived? The Caribs and the Arawaks, of course. But the truth is, Columbus was a colonialist, a slave trader, no different than Leopold, King Leopold, or Mussolini, in my eyes. Yet we had Columbus Square in Trinidad proudly, up until recently, of course. In taking it down, some people even said we were rewriting history. Well, that's a great bit of history I'd love to rewrite. That's how deep the brainwashing went, by the way. Removing, that disgusting, that vile part of our history. Some people were against it. That's how far the brainwashing went. Even today, our laws, our parliamentary system, our education system are all based on British colonial models. We took the oppressor's system and made it our own. And here's something else you may or may not know. I guarantee you may not have known this until now. Maybe you've heard me mention this in previous videos, I don't know, but when the slaves rebelled, as they often did, it's the main reason, including the Industrial Revolution. Rebellion and Industrial Revolution is what eventually ended slavery. But when the slaves rebelled, the British declared, or the British colonial system at that time declared what? A state of emergency to restore control. A state of emergency. What have we recently seen in Trinidad? We're still doing that today. Still using the slave master's tool, just rebranded for modern times. A state of emergency is a direct lift from our colonial masters. When the slaves rebelled, as they often did, a state of emergency was put in place to keep them under control. It was obviously a lot more brutal back then. The biggest colonial lie, that one race is better than the other. The biggest colonial lie that one race is better than the other. That lie still exists today in how we see ourselves, how we treat each other, and how we vote. We see it today, even down to how we love each other. And this needs to be called out. This needs to be called out. So in closing, I'd say this. If you've watched this far, thank you. I hope you see now the system for what it really is. It was never about African versus Indian. Say that again. It was never about African versus Indian. It was always about power. And the best way to keep power is to keep the people divided. And that is what they successfully did. Even to this day, you see the division. The good thing is, we don't have to stay divided. Just like we fought slavery and everything else, we can fight this. We simply have to understand, we simply have to be educated, we simply have to learn why we are the way we are to each other. We are not each other's enemies. We are one people under God. We bleed the same. It's high time we stop fighting each other. It's high time we stop fighting each other. That's the core of my message today. It's high time we start fighting together. I'm not here to sound like a preacher, but for a better Trinidad, for a better Caribbean, a future that's united, not divided, is completely necessary. I thank you for your time. I thank you for listening. And I hope you've learned something from this video today. I look forward to seeing what you have to say in the comments. Please like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys on my next video. For now, much love. God bless. Take care. Peace.